And I'm glad you couldn't pronounce the title of my first book because I wrote that when I was a heretic, so. So as you can probably glean, I'm not a bioethicist, right? I'm much more of a cultural critic. And I'm an unapologetic generalist. I love to range within disciplines. So you'll be getting some cultural analysis tonight, as well as a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of theology. And what I'm going to try to do in this talk is two things. The first is to give an analysis of two ways, two kind of dominant paradigms of thinking about sex in our culture. And then secondly, to present the Catholic way of thinking about sex as an alternative. So we'll be talking about three different paradigms. And my goal is that you will leave the room tonight, move to think more deeply, more holistically, and more theologically about your own body and about sex. So, we don't have a clicker, so I have a human clicker back there. And so I think I'm just going to say click. Gotcha. Okay. And thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. This is my first time in Baton Rouge. I have some Louisiana roots on my mother's side. My great-grandfather was a riverboat captain based out of New Orleans, but I've never been to Baton Rouge, so I'm very happy to be here. So thank you all for spending an evening with me. And I hope you enjoy your modular chairs. And anytime I offend you, you can signal that by turning your back. Actually, please don't do that, because that would be horrible and really terrible. But nonetheless, I'm going to be talking about sex, so I can't guarantee that I won't say something that isn't eyebrow-raising, perhaps. But I hope you came in maybe a little prepared for that. So, all right. What is sex for, according to popular culture? Let's start there. Sex permeates popular culture. It's everywhere. Magazine covers, commercials, ads, TV shows, music videos, song lyrics, movies, computer games, social media. And I want to use specific examples, but it's tough to find examples that are, one, sort of watchable in shared company, two, not super awkward to discuss in shared company, and also that would maybe be familiar to a wide age range, right? So I chose two things that have both been around for over a decade, so kind of these bastions of popular culture. So hopefully, or, well, either way, either you're vaguely familiar with them, and if you've made good life choices, you've never watched either of them, but if you're like me, you have. Okay, so, all right, Grey's Anatomy, maybe you've heard of it. Maybe, in fact, this inspired you to enter the medical profession because you wanted to be one of these fulfilled, shiny, happy people saving lives and going through all kinds of natural disasters at really unparalleled rates. So, Grey's Anatomy, the first thing we can learn is that Seattle is very dangerous. You need to move immediately. And the second thing we can learn is that hospitals are places where people either have sex or die. So what is sex for in the world of Grey's Anatomy? First of all, sexual desire is an uncontrollable tsunami that must be dealt with immediately, preferably in an on-call room, even if you've just been removing fecal matter from someone's impacted bowels. It doesn't matter. If you're in the mood, you got to get in the on-call room. Secondly, it's very difficult to contain the sex tsunami in a long-term committed relationship because there are so many other beautiful, shiny people surrounding you all the time that you could be sleeping with. And ultimately, your personal happiness and sexual fulfillment is more important than the stability of a long-term relationship. Thirdly, we learned that sex is always fun and pleasurable and refreshing and fun, and it rarely has long-term consequences, except maybe for the disintegration of relationships or the swapping out of different partners. In the world of Grey's Anatomy, the excitement of sex and the novelty of new partners help keeps the serial in serial monogamy. Look. We also learned that on television, there's lots of sex and few children. Real life tends to be the other way around. Grey's Anatomy has the occasional pregnancy, but very few compare with the prevalence at which everyone is getting laid. And those pregnancies either result in death, like abortion or miscarriage, or in children that are pretty much raised by someone else because they are rarely on screen. Let's be honest, sex makes for great TV, childbearing, not so much. Okay, so, it skipped a couple slides, but that's fine. I'm going to talk about another example. No, it's fine. Okay. Go back. I think it just, I had these like moving gifts, but I'll just reenact them for you. I think the computer was like, I can't handle it. Which is fine, because one of them was like pushing the edge a little bit. So the second pop culture example I want to talk about is The Bachelor. So, yes, okay. Sounds like we have some Bachelor fans. All right, again, if you make good life choices, maybe you've never actually watched it. But basically, the premise of the show is that you have an eligible bachelor who is dating starting out about 30 women, and then slowly kind of eliminates a few at a time until he gets down to 3, and then finally 2, and then finally 1, and then he's supposed to propose, and then they date for a few months and break up. So that's kind of how the trajectory works. And there's, late in the season, this episode, which is the Fantasy Suite episode. And in this, there's a date that usually goes like this. First, there's a profession of love. Then there's suddenly fireworks, literally fireworks happening. That was part of the gift. Okay. And a hot tub maybe in there. That's a hot tub and some steamy makeout session. And then they might imply that sex happens. Maybe there's a door closed while the camera kind of backs off. And then the shot the next morning, pan over some scattered clothes on the floor or something, right? So, but the implication is the fantasy suite is a place where not his final person, but his final 3 people he gets to try out before he decides which one he might want to marry. So there's nothing explicit here, but the producers make sure that we believe that sex has occurred. Then there's a shot of the door being shut, we transition to a morning scene. There's usually breakfast in bed with melon balls. So this all sounds like an ending to a romantic comedy, right? Except for this, there are 3 consecutive fantasy suite dates in a single episode. So you've got 3 women, 3 hot dogs. Well, I don't know. 3 sets of fireworks, 3 professions of love, 3 sets of melon balls, and wash, rinse, repeat. So one unlucky woman has this night in the fantasy suite, emphasis on the word fantasy here, and then gets sent home the next morning, right? And there's only 2 left. The logic here is that the fantasy suite is the place to test your connection, the bachelor's connection with the remaining women. Take the car for a test drive. Sleep with 3 women who have professed love to you. Choose the 2 you like best. Then think about maybe committing to one of them for probably just a few months before you break up with her because you're on Dancing with the Stars now, and there's so many other people who are dating. So this paradigm that I've chosen Grey's Anatomy and The Bachelor to exemplify is what I'm going to call the consumerist paradigm of sex, which dominates popular culture. In this paradigm, reality revolves. Oh wait, there it is! Oh, see, that was the part I wasn't sure about. Oh yeah, see, look. He said, maybe Kayla's the one for me. Nope, it's these 2. Yeah. Okay, you can continue now. Okay, that's great. You got a little taste of it there, but we got to pass through it quickly, so that worked out. All right, so in the consumerist paradigm, reality revolves around the autonomous, desiring self. I want, therefore I am. You hear this in the rhetoric of The Bachelor if you watch it critically, which is all, I swear, the only reason I watch it is as a cultural critic, I assure you. But you'll hear the contestants and the lead talk about my feelings, my connection, and I see my future with this person. There's very much an emphasis on what I want and what will fulfill me. So what is sex for in this paradigm? Recreation. It can be for procreation if you want it to, at which point you can flip the switch. But primarily, sex is about the fulfillment of one's individual desires. Because in this paradigm, all of reality is about facilitating the freedom of the individual to pursue his or her desires. This freedom is seen as unlimited, as long as it doesn't impinge on another person's autonomy. Within this paradigm, a certain view of the human person tends to emerge. And this is an instrumental view of the human person. So what do I mean by instrumental? I'm not talking about instrumental music. I'm talking about instruments as tools. Using another person as a tool, an instrument, a means to an end. Namely, a means to the end of fulfilling my desires. This person is the means by which my desires, whether that's for an orgasm, for intimacy, or for a child, are fulfilled. But because sex is sex with, it is an act that inherently involves another person, even if it's just a fantasized person or an image of a person, a recreational view of sex turns that person into an instrument for recreation, something that can facilitate my pleasure, my fun, etc. Pope Francis has spoken about our culture as a throwaway culture, and this absolutely applies to sex in the consumerist paradigm. And what's used and thrown away is a person, people. In addition to an instrumental view of the other, this consumerist mentality also creates, an instrumental and mechanistic view of one's own body. If autonomy is a central value of this paradigm, the human body, with its limitations, becomes an obstacle to be overcome in pursuit of unfettered and individualistic freedom. One's own body becomes a sex object. We see this in very literal ways with cosmetic surgery. One particular procedure, called a labioplasty, has skyrocketed in popularity since 2014. And that's because young women, because of widespread pornography use, are now having surgical procedures to make sure that their genitalia look more like porn stars. And this has been skyrocketing since 2014. So that's a literal objectification of one's own body, a sexual objectification of one's own body. And because bodily fertility is a threat to this overall value of autonomy, especially for women, the natural connection between sex and procreation must be severed. So this image illustrates how our pop cultural imagination views the relationship between sex and procreation. But it's a bizarre inversion, right? You've got the sperm going towards the egg. That's not an oops. The sperm are like, yeah, mission accomplished, right? I mean, that's what it should say. But instead it's presented as a mistake, as if this ever happens, then it should be unintended, right? That a sperm reaching the egg is sort of the last thing you want to occur from sex, rather than sex designed, intended purpose. So is there any sense of sexual morality in the consumerist paradigm? Any sense of what separates right sex from wrong sex? Yes. First of all, consent. Is my autonomy being violated? And connected to that, but secondarily, pleasure. Does this feel good to everyone involved? Those are really the only two moral ground rules for distinguishing between right or wrong sex in this paradigm. Now let me be clear. Consent is a good thing. Consent is crucial. And emphasizing the importance of consent is something good that this paradigm has to offer. But consent should be the beginning, not the end, of a discussion about sexual morality. It is not enough to simply say that the best we can expect from sex, morally speaking, is that it's not great. One consequence, I think, of the Me Too movement has been to reveal the fault lines in the consumerist paradigm. The poverty of a sexual morality that is based purely in consent, because it's clear that someone can be misused, abused, harmed by sex even when it's technically consensual. The era of sexual liberation is perhaps not as liberating for women as is claimed. slide is a Facebook post, an actual Facebook post that popped up on my wall back when I was on Facebook a couple years ago. And it's not from someone I know personally, but it was shared as a public post, and I think maybe one of my friends liked it, and that's how it came up on my feed. And I kind of blocked out any sort of identifying markers, even though it was public, so I don't feel bad about using it. So as you can read it, I'll read it with you. I've been waffling, this is a woman writing this. I've been waffling back and forth, wondering about whether to post this, because it's an intensely personal and multitudinously painful thing I'm going through. It's important to me, though, to put myself out there as an illustration of why it's so important to have safe, ready access to abortion services. This is the second time in my life I've been on long-term, regular hormonal birth control and gotten pregnant anyway. Practicing safe and protected sex is not foolproof. Being with a loving, long-term partner does not have me jumping at the bit to be a mother. And bringing a pregnancy to term is simply not an option for me, physically, emotionally, or financially. I sincerely feel that a woman has a right to choose in any scenario, birth control or not, monogamous partner or not, financially stable or not. Bodily autonomy exists, and it exists for a reason. So the first thing, I guess my first reaction when I read this was just feeling devastated for this woman, and also the choice that she decided to make. But secondarily, I had a reaction of seeing that last sentence that she has in her post, bodily autonomy exists and it exists for a reason. There's a very clear irony in what she writes, because her very predicament shows that in fact bodily autonomy does not exist for women in the way that it does for men. She would not be in this predicament if that were true. So she's bought into this lie that women have bodily autonomy, when in fact it has to be enforced on our own bodies in a particular way. And the way she chose is abortion. So the burden of this fantasy that sex has nothing to do with children falls heavily on women and their children. Men can have sex until their eyeballs pop out and they will never get pregnant, by definition. This is simply not true for women. And it's not true even in the case of long-term, regular birth control. In fact, my small little family is a testament to the failure of contraception. My husband was conceived after his mother had a tubal ligation. So it's kind of a miracle that he exists. Right? But he does, and our 3 children do. This Facebook post, and the thousands of experiences like it, because this is certainly not an isolated experience, they reveal something very important. The myth of complete sexual freedom, of bodily autonomy, is based on a fantasy of the male experience. We've all been sold a myth about what sex is, but it is women who pay the steepest price when this fantasy crashes into reality. So here's a quote by philosopher and writer Wendell Berry, who you may have heard before, but I think there's more to say, but I want to read the quote in its entirety. He writes, "In fact, our sexual revolution is mostly an industrial phenomenon, in which the body is used as an idea of pleasure, or a pleasure machine, with the aim of freeing natural pleasure from natural consequence." But like any other industrial enterprise, industrial sexuality seeks to conquer nature by exploiting it and ignoring the consequences, by denying any connection between nature and spirit, or body and soul, and by evading social responsibility. The spiritual, physical, and economic costs of this so-called freedom are immense. And we've been talking about some of those costs. This paradigm turns people into commodities. Just take a glance around at the widespread cultural problems: sex trafficking, hookup culture, sexual assaults on college campuses, STD epidemics, widespread porn use, and addiction. In pornography, we can see the distillation of the consumerist attitude towards sex. Human beings are reduced to voyeuristic images for voyeuristic consumption. And often these images are degrading and depersonalizing to both men and women. Porn trains us to think about sex in terms of ourselves, in terms of our pleasure, and other bodies not as human beings, who carry the divine image, but as instruments for us to facilitate our pleasure. But pornography ostensibly meets the criteria for moral neutrality in the consumerist paradigm. Because, again, I say ostensibly because you can never know when you're consuming pornography if what you're observing is consensual. But ostensibly, it's for consent and pleasure, right? So what's the harm? And that's why it's become mainstream. And pornography, I think, really shapes all popular pop culture representation of sex. There's another side to this coin. We've been talking about the implications of separating sex from procreation. But what about separating procreation from sex? One can see the same consumerist values at work here too. Infertility is an often devastating condition. And it's on the rise in our culture due to a number of factors, including declining sperm counts in men, and the trend for couples to delay marriage and child rearing into their 30s and 40s, when infertility rises dramatically for women in particular. In vitro fertilization, or IVF, is a loosely regulated billion-dollar industry that has arisen in response to the very real and tragic problems of infertility. But it's a solution that creates a number of ethical problems. In the case of IVF, procreation is entirely removed from the sexual act. Conception, if it happens, occurs in a petri dish at the hands of technicians. And the process of IVF generates excess embryonic human beings due to the high failure rate. So you need to have excess embryos because because ones you implant might not survive. Multiple embryos are often implanted in the uterus to increase the chances of a successful implantation. So from the outset, there is the expectation that some of the embryos will be created but then lost. And if more than desired successfully implants, sometimes the embryos are actually killed by the doctor to avoid a multiple pregnancy if the parents just wanted one baby. And what about the embryos that are created outside the womb and never implanted? Some of these are killed and discarded. Some become the subjects of scientific experimentation, and many of them are just put on ice indefinitely. According to a 2019 NBC News report, the number of abandoned human embryos in the United States could number in the millions. These embryos are alive and viable. They're tiny human beings, many of whom have been abandoned by the very parents who orchestrated their existence. So even though couples often turn to IVF with benevolent intentions and with a heartfelt and natural desire to have a child, the unfortunate reality is that these practices display a purely utilitarian treatment of embryonic human beings. The process of IVF treats children as disposable commodities that can be produced and then discarded according to the whims of adults. And this is the bottom line when we talk about this paradigm. The consumerist paradigm has created an unjust, solipsistic culture that revolves around the fulfillment of adult desires, often at the expense of the weakest and most vulnerable. So, what has been the most prominent Christian alternative in our culture? This is the paradigm I call the purity paradigm. I grew up as an evangelical in the evangelical Christian subculture, and the purity paradigm was presented as the prevailing Christian alternative to the secular or the worldly understanding of sex. You might think of the True Love Waits campaigns that started in the 1990s, the use of purity rings, and these purity balls, if you've heard of these dances, maybe you've been to one. The debates over abstinence only, education in schools, etc. So the cultural clashes about sex that we often see in the media and the political sphere tend to be between the consumerist paradigm and the purity paradigm. So the purity paradigm in a nutshell is wait until marriage to have sex, and if you don't, you'll lose your purity. So first of all, before I critique this paradigm, what is good here? Well, one good thing is that we're at least thinking about sex beyond the self, beyond simply the pursuit of individual desires. There is an inkling that we exist within and are accountable to a moral order that is higher than our own whims and urges. There's also a sense that sex has a context which it's meant to unfold within lifelong marital union. The purity paradigm upholds the expectation that sex belongs within marriage, but unfortunately, it really only preserves the rule without a sense of the full meaning, theological meaning behind it. Click. So what is sex for according to the purity paradigm? This question isn't really asked. The conversation tends to revolve around when to have sex, rather than the underlying principles of what sex is for, or why sex belongs in marriage. There's not much more than the Bible tells me so. Indeed, the question that dominates this conversation is, how far is too far? How far can I push the line before I transgress? Because the emphasis is on a rule, don't have sex until marriage, rather than the reasons behind such a rule. Click. So some problems with the purity narrative. Because it's rule-based, it tends to motivate through shame and fear. Don't transgress, don't break the rule. Rather than motivating through reason, through love, and through beauty. This rule-based approach can also create legalistic attitudes about sex. And I'm going to give you an extreme example, so buckle up, people. So I remember when I went to college at an evangelical school, there was a couple I knew who had anal sex in order to avoid losing their virginity, right? So you can, that's a very extreme example, but you can also see how the legalistic mentality behind that, right? As long as I don't transgress the rule, it's okay, we're still okay. I can think of myself as pure, I can think of myself as a virgin, which is the most important thing. So obviously, you're missing the spirit of the law in order to fulfill the letter. We often see the purity paradigm as well, double standards for men and women, which can actually feed into the sexualization of women, because there tends to be a lot more hand-wringing about whether or not women have lost their purity. When men mess up, it's often talked about as a mistake in behavior, stumbling, right? But when women mess up, it's talked about as almost an entire change in being or a loss of one's value. So this creates a damaged goods phenomenon, which is antithetical to the Christian gospel, which is a gospel of grace and continual conversion. So the purity paradigm offers a fundamentally reductive vision of purity. It can blind us toward other types of sins, right? Because it emphasizes sexual sins. And it leads us to define our entire spiritual and moral worth according to our sexual histories. And especially for women, this leads to a double standard, because it really locates a woman's worth in her sexuality. The purity paradigm also ignores the question of how to faithfully live out one's sexuality after getting married. The emphasis tends to just be like, just get to the goal line, you know, and then it's this, like, your body is a wonderland, you know, like 24/7. It's just a free-for-all, whatever. But guess what? It's still possible to use and objectify your spouse and yourself, right, to have a consumerist mentality, even in marriage. And so simplistic, misleading narrative about sex within marriage, that you just have to sort of like keep your knees together and hang on, and then once you get married, everything will be amazing and all your desires will be fulfilled. This creates kind of a strange sort of sense about sex where it's like, sex is bad, but then you'll get married and sex will be amazing, right? But unfortunately, you just heard all the time, like, sex is bad, don't do it, sex is bad. It's really hard to just flip a switch once you're married and have a healthy sense of your sexuality. So you can even see within the purity paradigm hints of a consumerist paradigm creeping in, with the idea that, like, oh, as soon as you're married, then all your desires can be fulfilled, right? Then you can live in this sort of bachelor fantasy. So the purity paradigm too easily lends itself to a consumerist vision of sex. It just simply locates it within marriage and kind of puts a fence around it. Even within the purity paradigm, we often have a view of a purely recreational view of sex, and with this idea of freedom as being the fulfillment of one's desires. You just have to delay it long enough. You just have to make sure you're married first. So the focus in the purity paradigm is not on an active lifelong virtue, such as chastity, but rather on physical virginity. In the purity paradigm, purity is shorthand for whether or not one has had sex. So the default state is purity, and then you're in danger of losing this purity permanently. The implied movement then is from purity to sin, and then you're just kind of marooned there. This is much different than the trajectory of the Christian life, in which the movement is from human sinfulness that we all share, and toward a life of purity, of increasing Christ-likeness. If purity is synonymous with virginity, it's something you either have or you don't. It can simply be lost, like, whoa, where did it go? And it's not something that you can just regain. But this is really at odds with the Christian notion, the holistic notion of like, purity as a lifelong process of being conformed to Christ. That's what purity is in the Christian understanding. It's not reductive to one's sexual history. It's not something you automatically have and then can easily lose and not really regain. Rather, it's a lifelong process of conversion. The purity paradigm gives us a rule to follow, but it does not give an overarching sense of ourselves in the context of a divinely created order. So what might that look like? So here we get to the third paradigm, the Catholic paradigm. This is a paradigm that emphasizes telos and incarnation. I'm going to dramatically drink some water here. Christian tradition gives us guidelines and rules about sex. It's true. But far more importantly, Christianity gives us a worldview. And what is the purpose, the meaning of sex within this worldview? I'm going to highlight two concepts that can help us develop a richer theology of sexuality. And those concepts are teleology and incarnation. So first, what does it look like to think about sex teleologically? Right. Teleology is the doctrine of design and purpose in the material world. The title of this lecture, What is Sex For?, is a teleological question, because it's concerned with the ultimate purpose or end of sex. It assumes that sex is for something, that there is an ultimate purpose for sex. So when I ask about the telos, the end, the purpose of sex as a Christian, I'm working from the perspective that the physical world, including our bodies, is divinely created and thus endowed with a God-given purpose. And because we are also endowed with reason, we can look closely at the created order and discern its divine design. The body itself then speaks of its purpose, its telos, through its form and function. So how do we read the body to discern the telos of sex? Let's think biologically for a minute. You guys are good at that, right? You're biology. There are many kinds of genital acts, intimate acts, but sexual union is unique. Sex involves one flesh union, and that's not merely a nice biblical metaphor. The act of sex creates a bodily union between two living beings whose bodies are uniquely designed to fit together to form a complete reproductive entity. Let's make an analogy with other bodily symptoms. All of our other bodily systems are complete, except for the reproductive system. Sex is the act of bringing together two incomplete but complementary reproductive systems to create one reproductive organism. You just imagine if our respiratory system functioned that way. Every time we had, like maybe one form of human had the lungs and the other had the diaphragm. And every time we just take a breath, we have to kind of join together quickly to take a breath, right? I mean, it's sort of absurd. Well, let's not talk about the digestive system. That could get weird. But you can sort of imagine, right, that we would readily see, if that were the case, that the bodily act of coming together in that way, bringing those two systems together, served a specific biological function. But in our cultural imagination, we've lost sight of the obvious. Remember the oops slide? That's how we think about sex. Oops, a baby happened. How did that happen? Something went wrong, right? The function is seen as a malfunction. Let's make another analogy with eating. We are more able to recognize a disordered use of a bodily symptom when we call bulimia, for example, an eating disorder. If someone were to eat just for the pleasure of taste, but then vomit the food, denying nutrition to the body, we would recognize that as a misuse of the body, something that undermines the well-being of the person. But we've lost that sensibility when it comes to sex, even though using our bodies and the bodies of others for temporary pleasure also undermines our human flourishing. There's a language, this is what Pope John Paul II says in his theology of the body. He talks about how the body speaks a language just by its physicality, especially in the act of sex. In the act of sexual intercourse, the body itself speaks the language of one flesh union, the language of a couple becoming a bonded pair. The body is saying in this moment, I am one with you. I give myself to you, my whole self, even my capacity to create life. When sex is taken out of the context of a lifelong union, out of the context of a self-gift that is not immediately taken back, then the language that the body speaks through sex becomes a lie. Remember that fantasy suite date? She said, I love you. And through sex, their bodies spoke, I belong to you. I'm giving myself to you. And the next morning, he dumps her. From the consumer's perspective, this is fine. This makes total sense. Of course, the bachelor needs to try out each woman before making his final decision. He needs to test sexual compatibility, right? And that's an interesting phrase there. I'm going on script. It just occurred to me. Sexual compatibility. What do we talk about that now just in terms of whether our pleasures align, right? Rather than in the context of an objective bodily reality. He needs to test sexual compatibility because he needs a partner whose desires are tailor-made to his. The compatibility isn't bodily, it's about desires. Try before you buy. But if we're thinking more theologically and teleologically from the scope of a Christian worldview, this attitude towards sex is an extreme distortion. Now, pleasure is certainly a feature of sex, but the pleasure is purposeful. It's oriented towards certain ends, certain goals. The pleasure does not merely exist for its own sake. What then is the purpose of that pleasure? There's a twofold telos in sex. You can't separate the one from the other. Union and procreation. The modern consumerist temptation is to pick and choose from a menu. I want a union, but no kids. I want a kids, but no union. Or I just want an orgasm without the mess of kids or a relationship. No, just pick and choose. But if we read the design of the body and see that sex has both unitive and procreative power, it brings together the couple in this intense kind of union. But it's a union that intrinsically has the potential for new life. If we read that design, and if we believe that God is not an arbitrary craftsman, then that means that these two powers of sex are meant to be interconnected. If we say that it's bad that they're connected, then we're saying that God's design is mistaken. The Catholic Christian tradition has preserved the full telos of sex as twofold, creating an enduring union that is open to the creation and care of new life. The one flesh union of the couple is not merely inward-facing, not only concerned with the happiness of two individuals involved. The unitive power of sex is connected to its fruitful power, and this is a synergetic power that can result in the creation of a new life. A couple then is bonded not merely for their own good, but for the good of another. To think about sex theologically and teleologically necessitates that we actively cultivate an awareness of its creative potential, its procreative potential. Rather than blindly absorbing the pop cultural attitude that sex is about recreation rather than procreation, we should adopt an attitude of being open to life and aware of life as a guiding principle. By openness to life, I mean a conscious acknowledgement and embrace of the divinely created reality of our sexed bodies, an active awareness that having sex could result in the creation of another human being, and thus it is a matter of justice. Justice to the Creator and justice toward the human person who could be brought into being. to decide to live harmoniously with the created order and refrain from sex unless it can occur in the context of a lifelong marital bond. We need to think about sex in terms of love and responsibility. The love of God and neighbor, and an awareness that our fertile embodiment endows us with a sacred responsibility. Sex is how we participate in the transmission of human existence. There's one thing you remember about this lecture, like that's the one thing I want rattling around in your brains. This adds a kind of gravity to sex that we've lost. That is why Christian tradition for 2 millennia has located marriage as the proper context for sex. It's not just an arbitrary rule meant to torture young people, or all. At a fundamental level, this rule springs from an awareness of the objective reality of the created order and our place in that order, and from an understanding ethic of love and justice. Love of God and his design, justice toward other human beings, especially those who are most helpless and vulnerable. So, incarnation. What does it mean to think about sex in terms of incarnation? The Word became flesh. This is an event, the turning point, the fulcrum of all human history. And if it is true that the Word became flesh, it is true that God became a human body, it changes everything. If this is true, then everything that exists, the natural world, all of human history, only has meaning because of this, and exists only to anticipate and celebrate this event, to prepare humankind for this descent of God into human existence. This means that God created bodies, body beings, so that one day he could become a body. Notice I didn't say inhabit a body as if the body is just this fleshly shell. God's not a ghost in the machine. God became a body. God created a visible, sensible world, a world of bodies, as a visible reality that could make the invisible tangible. All reality is sacramental in this way. All reality exists to make God known to us. That's the sacramental principle of Catholic thought. But what does it have to do with sex? This all sounds great, right? Everything. The fact that we are sexuate beings, that our embodiment comes as sexed, that human beings are characterized by sexual complementarity, that our continued existence as a species depends upon that reality. This, too, is all part of God's self-revelation to us. Let me repeat, sex is part of God's self-revelation. Conjugal union, marital sexual union, is the primary metaphor that we're given to understand Christ's relationship with us in Scripture and tradition. It's the conjugal metaphor. And the implications of this are profound. God designed human beings for sexual communion and self-giving love as a way to more deeply understand and embody our relationship with him. So how we think about sex is deeply important. A crucial aspect of God's self-revelation comes in the very design of our bodies. Like God, we have the power to create new life, but we can't do it alone as individuals. It must happen through love. We have to be united with another person through a total gift of self. And from that mutual self-giving springs the possibility of a new life. If we have a self-centered, mechanistic, pleasure-seeking view of sex, we distort this metaphor and lose its profound meaning. How we think about sex and how we think about the dignity of all human persons is connected. And how we think about sex and how we think about God and our relationship with him is connected. I recently came across a book by Josh Whedon and Robert Kurzban called The Hidden Agenda of the Political Mind. It's about how self-interest shapes our opinions. And as far as I know, they're totally secular academics. They're not coming from a Catholic perspective. But they have this fascinating chapter on religion and sexuality in which they distinguish between two groups of people they call ring bearers and freewheelers. So the key features of the ring bearers group, they tend to have fewer sexual partners, less drinking and drug use, more marriage, less divorce and cohabitation, and more children. The key features of the freewheelers: they have more sexual partners, more alcohol and drug use, more same-sex sex partners, less marriage, more divorce and cohabitation, and fewer children. So these kind of two basic groups. So their analysis revealed, starting in conclusion, that sexual lifestyle choice shapes religious engagement and not the other way around, right? Because you would often think that, oh, maybe if someone kind of disengages from their religious tradition, then their sexual choices would change. But what they actually found was it was the reverse. Here's a quote. What distinguishes those who go to church a lot from those who don't? The big distinguishing features, it turns out, involve sexual and reproductive lifestyles. People go to church more often when they have ring-bearer lifestyles, and more often eschew organized religion when they lead freewheeler lifestyles. In short, as young people start making their own decisions about their lives, they tend to match their religious participation to their lifestyles. So it's the choice of lifestyle that comes first, and then that kind of determines one's religious participation. So this shows that how we think about sex and how we sexually behave shapes how we think about God. Our sexual praxis shapes our religious praxis. Oh, whoops, there you go. Okay. More. This is a picture of Mount Angel Abbey, which is a seminarian abbey, the Benedictine abbey near where I live. And I wrote most of this lecture about sex while I was in a community of over 100 celibate men. Catholicism has a rich tradition and history peopled with saints, heroic individuals who offered up their sexuality as a gift to God. In the pop culture paradigm, people like that don't exist. Or if they do, they're just repressed, sad freaks. And that's a powerful lie. While I was working on this lecture, I took coffee breaks to talk with my friend Stephen. He was then a seminarian, now he's a newly ordained priest. And he and I live very different lifestyles. He's committed to lifelong celibacy, I'm married, but we are both trying to live out our sexuality in faithfulness under the Christian canopy. There are different models for the Christian life, different ways of living a holy life, and both come with suffering and sacrifice, as well as deep joy and different kinds of freedom. The consumerist paradigm will tell you that suffering and sacrifice must be avoided at all costs. That's what happiness means. But the Catholic paradigm proclaims the redemptive power of self-sacrifice, of self-gift. Something Stephen said to me has stuck with me. We've been tricked into thinking that what is meaningful about sex is only the pleasure of the act itself, rather than its fruits. But it's the fruits that are most meaningful. I'm not just talking about children, but I'm also talking about the union. The fruits of lifelong union and the gifts of new life. That's what makes sex meaningful, not the pleasure of the moment. In discussions of marriage, at least in the context where I work and live, there's disproportionate attention paid to the sex act itself. In discussions of celibacy, there's disproportionate attention paid to a lack of the sex act. How could you live without sex? The focus instead should be on the fruits, the unique fruits and freedoms of each state of life. The celibate vocation and the marriage vocation each reflect the dimension of God's love. God loves both everyone, all of humankind. He has a universal love, but he also seeks a kind of union with each individual. And on the human side, we have two states of life, marriage and celibacy, that each mirror one of those aspects of divine love, God's universal love and God's particular love. The celibate or single person is freer to love more broadly, to embody God's universal, non-particular love in a way that a married person cannot. Each state of life comes with particular fruits and freedoms and sacrifices. Here's the bottom line. Christianity is not about the elimination of sexual desire, but the orientation of it, the channeling and shaping of it for the sake of love. In a truly Christ-centered paradigm, everyone is called to self-sacrifice when it comes to sex. We are all called to reorient our sexual desires for the sake of love. Whether you're married or not, whether you're straight, whether you're gay, whether you're just confused, it doesn't matter. We're all in the same boat. We all have unruly desires, and we're we're all called to shape those desires for the sake of love. If we think about sex and marriage as existing to fulfill our own needs, and we've missed the whole point. If we think that the celibate life is all about self-renunciation, but married life isn't, we've missed the point. We're living in the bachelor fantasy. Sex is meant to lead us somewhere into Christ-like, self-giving love. And distorted consumerist ideas of sex simply lead us away from love and back toward ourselves, towards slavery rather than